Good morning. I'm trying to wake you up. I am going to start off Saturday morning with a bang. And I'm going to ask you to use your brains. And I know it's hard to do, just waking up, yawning. No. This is some powerful and important things that I'm going to present to you. Basically, I'm going to throw out some big ideas for this first lecture. And we're going to stop occasionally and just ponder. The goal here is to think about how to learn, how to think, how to approach subjects without actually dealing with lots of data. My next two presentations are going to be filled with data. But we can't approach that until we understand how we're supposed to even begin a discussion on complex subjects. I'm Dr. Robert Carter, for those of you who don't know me. I'm going to be also taking some polls throughout this morning. So my first poll, who was here 2 years ago when Joel Tay came here, gave a presentation? About half of you. Okay, so half of you either don't know CMI or don't know me or what we do. But we are a 40-plus-year-old organization with we're in 7 different countries. We have about 30 different speakers. And before COVID-19, we were giving about 1,300 presentations around the world every year. And we're just starting up again. It's actually my second time on the road in the past year and a half. So it's really good to be back in the saddle. It's really good to be addressing people and meeting awesome people. And I've met several great people already this morning. Just like a 3-point sermon, I'm going to give you 3 big ideas to take home. First, science is a branch of philosophy. We must understand that, or we can't talk about science. Second, there are more things we don't know than we do know. Most scientists, at some point in their career, are faced with their own mortality, and they don't want to admit it. Very rarely will you hear a scientist say, "I don't know." That's very uncomfortable. And yet we have to acknowledge that the mysteries of the universe are still mysterious. We do not know what gravity is. We do not know what light is. We do not know what electromagnetism is. Those are the fundamental forces of the universe, and we have no clue what powers them. We can use them, but we don't know what they are. And I want to leave you with the impression that it is reasonable, therefore, to trust the Bible. But we have to get there one step at a time. Second show of hands. Vote. Or not vote, but poll. How many people get our weekly email newsletter every Friday? Not many. Okay, perfect. We have a service we call InfoBytes. It is a thing we put together. Basically, we'll identify some hot topic science things that are happening in the world. We'll write up some articles about that. We'll have links to that. And we'll link to other interesting articles, sometimes topically, sometimes just really interesting stuff. And we throw it out there to all the people on our list. In fact, we know that we post an article on our website, creation.com. Very important piece of internet real estate. We know how many views we get. It's pretty good. And then we send this out on a Friday, and the views go boom. It's a great way to communicate with our people. So this is what we'd like to do. If you'd like to get our email newsletter, I'll give you 3 options of how to do so. First, you can take your phone and point at the screen and get a capture of that QR code. Second, you can email or text, send a text to that phone number, 470-344-4636. Include your email and your zip code. And I'm going to leave that barcode up and the phone number for the next couple of slides just so you have it. But you can also just put your name down on this form that's going to be passed around while I'm speaking. If it gets around in the next 45 minutes, that's fine. But people just kind of just like that. Hand it around until they're passed out. Okay. And there is that QR code again. Okay, I promised you some big ideas. Here's our first big idea. The question of what is evolution? Have you ever considered what evolution actually is? If I were to ask you, please define evolution, what would you say? Do you have an answer? Well, in textbooks, in media, presentations on YouTube, you name it, almost always I hear, oh, evolutions just change over time. Is that true? Well, yes and no. The word was around before evolutionary theory came to be. The word means unfolding. The word means change over time. The word means development. And it's used in a lot of different scientific disciplines before Charles Darwin. But the question is change over time sufficient? Because I'm a creationist. I believe in change over time. So if both sides believe in change over time cannot be a definition of evolution. Instead, you have to include the phrase common ancestry. Enough change over enough time can possibly be used to explain the common ancestry of all things. Evolution is a belief in common ancestry. Change over time is just a way to explain it. So, I'm a biologist. My training is in marine biology and genetics, but I'm not an evolutionist. And the reason for that is, as my first slide, science depends upon philosophy. Science is a branch of philosophy. Science and philosophy work together. If you take the study of life, biology, and add the philosophy of naturalism, what's that? Well, that's the belief that natural processes explain everything. So biology plus naturalism will give you evolution. There's no other thing to happen. It has to be evolution. Because things have to come about through natural processes. But if you add to biology the philosophy of theism, some belief in God, you're going to get a form of creation. Now, if you ask me what form of creation I believe in, you would call me a young earth creationist. I really don't like that label. I could say biblical creationist, but that sounds a little pretentious too. The Bible very clearly says that God created everything in the universe a few thousand years ago. That's my position. I take a philosophy, a belief, a preconceived notion that God exists and the Bible is true. I apply that to the science of biology, and that's why I'm a creationist. Does that make sense? Are we okay so far? Second big idea for you. Let's park on this for a minute. How do you know what you know? How do you know it's true? Because someone taught it to you? Because you read it in a book? No. How do you know? That is a very interesting question that has tangled up philosophers for thousands of years. How do you know that God didn't create the universe yesterday and implant your brain with false memories? You actually can't know that. To know anything is a tremendous statement of faith. You have to trust. You have to trust your own perceptions. You have to trust your own brain. Yes, you have to use your brain to know anything. But sometimes, especially in this modern world, when we're trying to learn something, it feels like we're drinking from a fire hose. And with the advent of the internet, that fire hose is flooding us with misinformation. I gave a talk a couple years ago at one of our super conferences on flat earth theory. And I invented something I called, as a joke, Carter's rule of information contamination. And that is that for everything that is true, eventually there will be someone claiming it is not true. And when we reach the point where every single true thing has a contradiction, we lose all knowledge. Because then you can't know what's true. And we're there probably already. And a huge problem is that there's some very confident people out there giving presentations, and yet they're not saying what's true. And you can pick politics, science, religion, and pick a topic There are people saying blah, 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 and yet someone else is saying blah, 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 and they completely contradict each other, and they seem so very confident about what they're saying. And we're just a bunch of chumps. I mean, how do we know what they're saying is right or not? We also don't have their expertise. You have authority figures, government, politics, religion, science, and they're saying all this stuff. And we don't have the knowledge base to really know if what they're saying is true. So what happens? We distrust everybody. It is not a good position for a whole society to be distrustful. And this whole COVID-19 situation, which I didn't even want to bring up, it's a great analogy. There's nothing but distrust and tons of disinformation, and we can't tell what's true. That is not a good position to be in. And here's the worst part about this. You think you know something? I assume most people in this room are Christians. Not everybody, but I assume most of you are Christians. I assume most of you don't hang out with atheists. I assume most of you don't hang out with biker gangs who are doing drugs and using four-letter words and using, breaking the commandments all the time. Why? Because it's uncomfortable. Just like the guys in the biker gangs don't want to hang out with you. It's uncomfortable. We tend to hang out with people that are like us. They look like us, they eat like us, they listen to music we listen to, they have the same cultural backgrounds. That is human nature. But the worst part about this is that Google and Facebook and YouTube do it for us. Because if they showed us a whole bunch of things that we didn't like, that was not kind of like where we are, we'll leave and go to another platform. This is the reason why two different people can do the same Google search and they get different answers, because Google already knows who you are and they're giving you things that they think you want to know. So how do you know what you know? And now we apply that thought to science. We have to understand there are several forms of science. One form of science is what you learned in 8th grade. This is middle school science. It's called operational science. It's how things work. You learn to observe and test and repeat experiments today, right now, right here. Things you can hold in your hand and watch with your eyeballs. That type of science is pioneered by Christians. The type of science has led to the development of all of our modern technology. Why Christians? Because they're the people who said, God created the universe. God is logical. God is knowable. God is constant. God is the ultimate lawgiver. God never does anything against his own nature. If he created the universe should reflect the basic characteristics of God. Law. That is where the idea of scientific law came from. It didn't develop in ancient Greece. Their gods were fickle. They couldn't run an experiment. What if Zeus didn't like you? He could send a lightning bolt down and kill your mice. It doesn't work in pagan societies. Imagine you do some experiment, but you believe there are pixies in the garden and they're mischievous. Or what if they come in through the window in the night and they rearrange your test tubes? No, the reason science developed in the Western world specifically was because of this direct application of a biblical principle that God is constant, therefore so is the universe. But the whole creation evolution issue is different. We're not arguing over the boiling point of water. We're not arguing over the force of gravity. We're arguing over things that happened in deep, remote history that no one was there to observe. This is called historical science. And historical science is tricky. It's still science, but it's difficult because most of it's not observable. It's definitely not repeatable because it only happens once. And it's not testable. We don't have time machines. You can't go back in time to 1939 and shoot Hitler 100 times and then as a control go back and not shoot Hitler 100 times and then see how history unfolds. It's not possible. The universe happened once. That is not operational science. And yet this is where the debate is. If you can understand the difference between those two types of science and why the debate is so difficult, you'll have a tremendous leg up as we're trying to reach the world with different ideas. In fact, it was pioneered by Christians like Johann Kepler, who was caught up in the Protestant Catholic wars, fleeing from city to city with his data books. And he discovered the 3 laws of planetary motion. The laws that NASA used to fly this rover around and land it on Mars. The same exact laws discovered by this man who said of his work it was like thinking God's thoughts after him. But it wasn't just Kepler. In fact, most of the founders of modern science were people who believed the Bible. Why? Because the Bible commands us to study. The Bible commands us to think. The Bible claims the universe makes sense. That's why. Okay. So how come it's not true today? How come most scientists today are not Christians? How come most scientists today have a completely different philosophical backing than the people who laid down the laws of modern science? What happened? Well, something happened in the late 1600s, 1700s, something called the Enlightenment. This is where we get the phrase, the Dark Ages, which modern scholarship has rejected. We now call it the Middle Ages, maybe even the medieval period, the Dark Ages. Basically, they said everything before us was dark. We're enlightened. You see that? What a statement. The people who invented windmills and eyeglasses and all the modern things that we use for farming, they were dumb, according to the Enlightenment philosophers. And what they did is they took the idea that there was law in the universe and got rid of God. And they just kept the law. And that's what we have today. Scientific laws. The law of gravity. Why is there a law of gravity? They don't answer that. There just is. And the assumption that the law of gravity has always been exactly the same throughout the entire history of the universe. Wow, that is a huge assumption. You cannot know that. The reason the universe is because God. The reason the universe is like it is because God. All right, in the beginning I said to you that science is a branch of philosophy. Have I made my case? Do we need to say any more to clearly demonstrate you cannot escape the philosophical trap? And scientists do not want to talk about this. I was taught none of this, even through my PhD classes. No one talked about philosophy, but they were absolutely teaching a philosophy. I can prove it very easily. I have a PhD. What does that stand for? The D is doctorate. The PH is philosophy. I have a doctorate in philosophy? What? What philosophy? What philosophy? It's a philosophy of naturalism. That is a philosophy that undergirds modern science. If we can understand that, now we can talk about it. This whole creation evolution thing, people throwing barbs about, carbon dating and this and that. No, it's all about philosophy. Hebrews 11:3. By faith we understand the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made of things that are visible. The universe didn't come about by itself. Natural processes didn't create the universe. God created the universe. We okay so far? All right. Park on this one for a minute. Truth. The universe was created. Truth. The universe is naturalistic. Can we handle both of these things at the same time? These are both true. Can we handle that? Because the evolutionary scientists want to say, naturalism, therefore no God. Well, no. Naturalism because God. If there's no God, how do you know you can even trust the universe? Oh, Big Bang. Okay, how do you know the Big Bang is not actually going in reverse? How do you know that it actually followed some scientific laws that you couldn't observe? In fact, you have to violate those scientific laws to get that expansion anyway. How do you know anything? Truth. Naturalism is a wonderful philosophy for the laboratory. It works wonderfully, awesome, perfect, great. You don't assume weird things are happening. You assume that what you're observing is due to some scientific law. You might not know it yet, but by proceeding through the thoughts, you can figure it out. Hence, see, my very educated mother just served us. They discovered Uranus. I think the 16 or early 1700s, somewhere back there. It's a planet. You can see it kind of. It's really easy to see with a telescope. But about that time, they discovered this planet Uranus. Uranus had gone around its orbit about 3/4 of the way over about 80 years. And something wasn't right. It was just wrong. It's not where it's supposed to be. They factored in the gravitation of Jupiter and Saturn, and there's another planet. And so a German scientist wrote the Berlin Observatory. He said, hey, point your telescopes there. And that night, they discovered Neptune. Why? Because naturalism is a great science for the laboratory. But it's a lousy science for explaining origins. The origin of life, the origin of the universe, the origin of matter, all of these things fly in the face of everything we know from the laboratory. Life specifically, chemicals don't form long chains. Chemicals don't spell out information. Biological chemicals don't exist in nature. They're rapidly destroyed after you die. The cell opens up, those things just get obliterated by oxygen and water. Life is hyper complex. The natural world is simple comparatively. You might have struggled in chemistry. Yeah, wait till biochemistry. Wait till physical chemistry. Oh. I don't have nightmares about PChem. Oh boy, all those maths, crazy stuff. And yet that's nothing compared to the world of biology. We have a documentary and a book companion on the tables out there. There's Evolution's Achilles Heels. There's 3 years of my life that went into this. We talk about 8 major branches of science, and basically we say, this argues for creation. We talked about the origin of life, natural selection, genetics, the fossil record, the rock record, radiometric dating, and the Big Bang. We said all those things argue for creation. That's out there. This is high school level and above material, but really good stuff. All right, we okay? Everyone do this. Park on this for a second. So science has several different definitions. What if we were to find science as a way of thinking, or a filter, an interpretive filter of reality? Imagine that reality is these vertical red lines, and science is those diagonal gray bars. Can you see that the more you line up your way of thinking with reality, the more you'll get right? Can you see that? But can you also see that even if your thinking is wonky, you still might get some things right? Evolution. Evolution absolutely gets some things right. No doubt about it, it gets some things right. But it doesn't mean it's right. It got a lot more right than earlier Christian thinking, because most Christians were thinking, due to Aristotle, that species don't change, which is not true. The Bible doesn't teach that, by the way. Just consider the passage of Jacob breeding those sheep and stealing from Laban. He changed the coat color of a species under his care in just a few years. Species change. Now, I'm not claiming that I have a perfect filter. I'm not claiming I understand things expertly and with no error. That would be hubris. That would not be true. But I do believe that the biblical model is a much better explanation. And as we delve into Scripture, we learn more and more and more, and it's just becoming more and more clear over time that we have a great description of life and the universe, and naturalism flops. For example, what's natural selection? What is that? Is that evolution? No. Is it proof of evolution? No. But it's also not magic. It's a very unfortunate phrase, because nature can't select. Nature's not alive. Nature's not conscious. Natural selection, ugh. However, in English, we don't have another way to say things that happen all by themselves with no outside directed forces of any kind. We just say natural. Yeah, nature is a Roman goddess. Okay. But how else do we say it in English? Herbert Spencer, Charles Darwin's good friend, came up with the phrase, survival of the fittest. That's also not a great phrase. Why? Because who's the most fit? The biggest? The strongest? The fastest? The smartest? The one with the best eyesight? The fastest reflexes? No, 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 and no. By evolutionary definition, the one who's the most fit is the one who has the most children. Reproduction is a definition of fitness. Now, this drives atheists crazy because people who believe in God tend to have a lot more children than people who don't. So philosophically, by evolutionary definitions, Christianity is a superior philosophy. But biologically, it's simply the organism that does the best will have more offspring. Okay, whatever. That's not really a challenge. Now, the examples that they've used over time have been pretty wrong, like the peppered moth example. You know, the example of in England during the Industrial Revolution, they put so much carbon from coal burning into the atmosphere, it blackened the trees, and in this one species of moth that had white or gray versions and dark versions, Biston bechellaria, the peppered moth, all the light versions disappeared and the black versions were there. And then when they cleaned up the smokestacks, they switched back again. You've heard this, right? And you've seen a picture of the bird on a tree, and he grabs the light-colored moth in the dark trunk, or the dark-colored moth in the light trunk. Natural selection, except those moths were dead and they had been glued in place, and they don't rest on tree trunks during the day. And now we know that the caterpillars change their color depending upon the color of the stick they're on. What if it's not natural selection at all? What if it's just physiological adaptation to a local environment? Like you getting tan in the summertime and losing your tan in the wintertime. Same thing. It's nothing to do with evolution at all. But natural selection, we have written a lot on creation.com. It is not a challenge. We just welcome it into the creationist world. It's simply differential reproduction. Who reproduces better in the Arctic, a black bear or a white bear? The white bear, because he can sneak up and get close to that hole in the ice where the seal's popping his head up. The black bear can be seen a mile away. Who does better in the forest, the brown bear or the white bear? The brown bear. That brown bear stops moving and he disappears. Oh, I just saw him. Where'd he go? And if he's not moving, you can't see him. But a white bear, oh, there he is. Just differential reproduction. Consider this example. This is from our movie Evolution's Achilles Heels. We have two bacteria, a normal bacteria and a mutant bacteria. The normal bacteria has a large pore, so food, those little molecules can get in, but so can that purple antibiotic. But the degenerate mutant bacteria has a small pore, the antibiotic couldn't get in. So in this condition, who lives and who dies? The degenerate lives. The robust, non-mutant version dies. Most all examples of bacterial resistance to antibiotics are because something is broken. Is that evidence of evolution then? See, evolution is not just change over time. It's upward change, not downward change. You can't break things for evolution to occur because it took millions of years to evolve those things in the first place. And so many examples of flightless cormorant, wingless beetles, and on and on and on. We see examples of things that have something broken, and yet it helps them to adapt to a local environment. In the case of the wingless beetles of Madeira Island, it's very windy. A beetle that flies gets blown out to sea. The beetle with the mutation doesn't get blown out to sea, so it stays around to reproduce more. You okay? Yeah, Saturday morning, what are you doing, Carter, man? I want to go watch a football game. No, stop. Okay, no, this is learning time. Okay, another thing to park on for a moment. I call this the two worlds fallacy. Imagine the world of creation in blue. Imagine the world of evolution in red. Is it true that every factoid that I find that supports evolution disproves creation? Is it true that every factoid I find that supports creation contradicts evolution? That's the way we approach it, isn't it? We try to get all these facts. No, you can't explain any of these, therefore you must be wrong. But that's not how it works. Because both theories are trying to explain the same data set. Natural selection is accepted by both sides. Change over time is accepted by both sides. That area of overlap is an area of non-discriminating information. It's information you cannot use to discredit one side. You cannot use that information to say, we win. It doesn't work that way. And yet, Charles Darwin wanted natural selection to say, we win. What's in that area of overlap? Tons of things. What's not in that area of overlap? The argument. You want to argue creation evolution, you got to get outside of something both parties accept. The problem is, as soon as you just say change over time, the evolutionist is going to say, oh, you believe in evolution. And now you're on the back foot. Where do you go from here? Say, no. Let's argue about something real. Let's talk about the origin of life. They've been avoiding that question from the beginning. Charles Darwin said, to speculate about the origin of life, you might as well speculate about the origin of matter. Well, they do that today, Mr. Darwin. It's called the Big Bang. He tried to avoid the question. Today you hear a lot of evolutionists saying, oh no, evolution is just about living things. So once you have living things, you can talk about evolution. Wait a second, what about chemical evolution? What about prebiotic evolution? All these decades, for over a century, you've been talking about chemicals recombining and all of a sudden you get life. And they want to just ignore that because they know that this argument lies outside of the place that they're comfortable. It's outside the place we're comfortable sometimes also. But I think we have great arguments, powerful arguments, which my next two discussions, we're going to talk about some of them. Okay, park here for a moment also. For a very long time, it seemed that Darwinian evolution explained everything. I'm glad I don't live in the 1800s. I'm glad I don't live in the early 1900s. I would have had very little to say. It would have been a very, very difficult time. But basically, they thought life was simple. And if life is simple, evolution might be true. The simpler life is, the easier it is to change it. But the more complex life is, the harder it is to change it. I mean, what's easier to change, this water bottle or this computer? I'll poke a hole in the water bottle. I'll draw a Sharpie on the water bottle. I'll crunch it up and put water in it. So I do all sorts of stuff. I wouldn't touch my computer. There's no way. I would not do any of those things to this thing right here because it's too complicated. It's too fragile. Oh, it's fragile. Yeah, complicated things are fragile. Once you have it, you can modify it using intelligence and care. But random changes will destroy it. And life is nothing except complicated. I ignore the TV. Let's talk about how we go from one language to another inside the cell. That is a strand of DNA. 4 letters, A, T, G, and C. We have to make a copy of this DNA and turn it into protein. Oh, we're going to use that red thing. That's called a polymerase. It's zipping down. We are way oversimplifying this. We're just magically showing the nucleotides floating inside. They get matched up to one strand of the DNA only in a section of DNA we call a gene. They come out the other end, and now we have another molecule. It's a single-stranded molecule. We call this RNA. 4 letters in DNA, A, C, G, and T. 4 letters in RNA, A, C, G, and U. Now we're going to take this 4 letters and change it to a protein using these things. These are called transfer RNAs. On the bottom of the transfer RNA is a 3-letter code that matches up with 3 letters in the RNA. They go into this other machine called a ribosome. The ribosome does all the matching. In fact, if it makes a mistake, it backs up, fixes it, and goes forward again. Whoa. And on top of the transfer RNAs are amino acids. And one at a time, they're added to a growing protein strand. But that protein, most proteins, will be like a slinky that you twist up too much, goes sprawling, and you ruin it. They need help being folded. So these other proteins, which are also manufactured in this process, grab onto the protein strand and don't let it fall. They're called chaperones. The chaperone proteins bring it to another protein machine called a chaperonin. We're not exactly sure how this works, but we know it's shaped kind of like a watermelon, so we colored it green. And the unfolded protein goes in one side. Something magic happens in the middle of it, and if it doesn't fold properly, this thing will chop up the protein and recycle the parts. But out the other end will pop a 3-dimensional folded protein. We just went from a 4-letter linear alphabet to a 20-letter 3-dimensional alphabet, and most of these proteins can change shape in the 4th dimension time. And the properties of this protein have absolutely nothing to do with the chemical properties of A, C, G, and T. But all the steps that we showed were dictated by proteins. So you need proteins to make a protein. What came first? Worse than that, you need energy, and that energy comes in the form of ATP, and the ATP synthase motor is a bunch of proteins. So you need ATP to manufacture the motor that makes ATP, and that's all coded into the DNA, which is then transcribed into RNA and then translated into protein, and you get this gigantic chicken and egg problem with multiple directions, like a 5-way chicken and egg problem. And without all these things being in place at the same time, you don't have life. So, Mr. Darwinist, I don't care if you think that evolution is just change over time, because you can't explain this. And this is where life starts. Consider Psalm 92:4. For you, O Lord, have made me glad by your work. At the works of your hands I sing for joy. As a biologist, I have the privilege of singing for joy when I consider the works of God inside the cell. And it is a privilege to study God's handiwork. And it's really complicated. Here's a sped-up version. You see the polymerase zipping up and down the DNA strand? It's making copies in RNA, but notice they don't stop and start in the same place. It turns out that most letters in the genome, on average, are factored into 6 different RNA messages. And most of those aren't made into protein. These are RNAs that control the production of the protein. But if you change that letter, it might change something like how well you see in the dark and whether or not you hiccup after you eat garlic. Random things that have nothing to do with one another, are all coded with the same letter set. And now we have a massive problem. Because if you have information that's overlapping, you can't change it because of the complexity. Back in the early days of biology, they had the one gene, one enzyme hypothesis. Basically working on bacteria, which are very simple organisms, they said, oh, this section of DNA makes a protein. This section of DNA makes a different protein. This section of DNA makes a different protein. That's no longer true. Because in the human genome, you have a gene, and there's little pieces inside the gene called introns or exons. And the exons, they join together to make a protein. The problem is the exon in this gene can be used in dozens of other genes, and they're totally different. They have nothing to do with one another, and yet this little piece of what we thought was a gene is actually used in dozens of other genes. Oh, it's complicated. You ever seen a picture of this? Stanley Miller, the Miliuri experiment. Back in the 50s, they took some simple chemicals, ammonia, methane, water, and hydrogen. They put it in a boiling flask and let it circulate, and they sparked it, zap, zap, zap. And they cooled it and let it condense in the bottom, fed it back in the flask, and they just kept on circulating it. This is the first experiment when they said, aha, we have discovered the origin of life. Because in that tube on the bottom, they discovered amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. It says, see that? It's easy. It's trivial. All you need is these simple chemicals and a little bit of energy like lightning or something like that, and you can get the building blocks of life. And once you have the building blocks of life, life will spontaneously just form all by itself. Is that true? Is it true? Because this convinced most people that evolution is true. Two problems. One, yeah, they proved that random chemical reactions produce random chemicals. They did get some amino acids, yep, and a bunch of tar. The amino acids were very, very rare. Two, there were some amino acids they could not produce in this situation, and they could not produce ATP or ADP or tons of other biochemicals that life depends upon. This produced simple chemicals only. Third, they got no long chains. Because you see, life depends upon long molecules. DNA. The DNA in your body is this long in every single cell. 6 feet in a cell this big. Chromosome 1 is over a foot long. One molecule is over a foot long. You have long chains of sugars in your cell. We call them carbohydrates. You have proteins in your cells. You have RNA in your cells. You depend upon very long molecules. The thing is, if you take, like let's say you put sugars in a test tube, and you shake it up, and you just let it, shake it up, or you add energy, heat it up, whatever you want to do. And you go in there after a week, after a month, after 100 years, you might find 2 sugars that are linked together. You might find 3 sugars that are linked together. You might maybe find 4. They do link together spontaneously. They do, sure enough. But there's water in the solution. Water breaks the bond faster than it forms. So if you want life, you have to take away the water. Any organic chemist is going to tell you, if I want to do a synthesis reaction where I'm making a polymer, the first thing I do is I remove all the water from the solution. So how do you get life? The earth is covered in water. Major problems. As far as the origin of life is concerned, there is no source for complex organic molecules. They can't make polymers. They can't prevent the polymers from breaking down. They don't have a way to make them quickly. And who cares? Who cares? I will give them millions of years and a soup. I will give them an energy source. I will give them long organic molecules. I will give them prototypical cells with DNA inside. I'll give them everything they want. And they still can't have evolution. Because without information, you have no life. And information doesn't come from randomness. That's the greatest Achilles heels of evolutionary theory I can think of. They have no way to explain where life came from. So everything in chemistry, everything in physics, everything in probability theory, everything in information theory says the origin of life is an intractable situation that's not going to occur. You know what this is? This is the world's smallest motor. It's an electric motor. You have, trillions of these in your cells. All of life depends upon this motor. It's called the ATP synthase motor. But unlike our motors that run on electrons, it runs on protons. And the protons building up inside a membrane, they come out and they make this thing spin. And as it spins, there's these little veins that are flapping up and open and close. And they're taking this molecule called adenosine diphosphate, ADP, which does not exist in nature because it's too reactive. And they're adding a phosphate to it. The phosphate is really hard to find in nature. Because a phosphate, if it touches any metal, it forms an insoluble salt and precipitates out a solution. Which is why Florida is the phosphate capital of the world. They harvest all these phosphate rocks, they crush them up, they chemically treat them, they send them up here for farmers to spray on their fields. Because phosphate's really hard to find. But this molecule, ATP, is formed by joining ADP and a phosphate. So you're talking about the most improbable molecules possible, and this is the basis of life. You make your weight of ATP every day. And yet, this system is dependent upon proteins. That motor there is made up of a bunch of different proteins that require ATP to be produced. How do you get life started? Psalm 139:14. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well. Biology is a source of worship. And if we don't approach science in a worshipful way, we're missing the boat. Because our God created it. All right, one last thing to park upon. One last big idea. Think of the smallest thing that you can see. Maybe there's a speck of dust floating in the light. Can you see that? Just a tiny little thing. Think of the biggest thing that you can see and know how big it is. The moon, the sun. We know how big they are because we can use math and rulers and triangulation. But most people are like, okay, I know how big this building is. You probably don't even know how big the town is because you can't keep the whole town in your brain at the same time. Maybe if you've flown over the town, you've seen the whole thing or looked at it from satellite, okay, fine. But really, that's about it, right? What's the biggest thing you can think of that you know how big it is? Maybe you've hiked over a mountain many times and you know every nook and cranny on this mountain, so you have a pretty good idea how big the mountain is. Do you know how big the earth is? No. Think of the shortest possible time span that you can notice. The blink of an eye, the snap of a finger. Think of the longest possible time span that you can notice. Maybe when you were a child, your father planted a tree in the front yard. And now that you're grown up, you've watched this tree grow your entire life. That's it. You can't know anything that happened before you. Your personal experience is limited. Right? We're in a box. I call this a zone of direct observation. Now, we have invented things like microscopes and telescopes and atomic clocks and history, so we can expand our personal knowledge to a realm of instrumentation and a realm of documentation. But the historical period only goes back a few thousand years. Outside of this, you can only draw deductions based on assumptions. And that is where the creation-evolution debate is. We cannot observe what we need to know if evolution or creation is absolutely true. You all right? All right, let's end up here. Alvin Plantinga is a philosopher. He said, if you exclude the supernatural from science, then if the world, or some phenomena within it, are supernaturally caused, as most of the world's people believe, you won't be able to reach that truth scientifically. Observing methodological naturalism, you know what that means now, right? Thus hamstring science by precluding science from reaching what would be an enormously important truth about the world. It might be that just as a result of this constraint, even the best science in the long run will end up with false conclusions. Another scientist, Bill Provine, a scientist at Cornell, he died a couple years ago of brain cancer. Before he died, he said this, "Let me summarize my views on what modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear. There are no gods, no purposes, no goal-directed forces of any kind. There's no life after death. When I die, I'm absolutely certain I'm going to be dead. That's the end for me. There's no ultimate foundation for ethics. No ultimate meaning to life, and no free will for humans either." Why doesn't he believe in free will? Well, he's not a Calvinist. Come on, why doesn't he believe in free will? He thinks that every single thought that you have is dictated by the genes you inherited from your fish and monkey ancestors. and those genes helped you survive. That's why you're here. They're controlling your very thoughts, your very perceptions, your very beliefs. If you have a belief in God, it's because you have the God mutation. This reductionist belief is actually kind of terrifying. But it goes all the way back to Darwin. This is from his autobiography. Thus, disbelief crept over me at a very slow rate, but was at last complete. The rate was so slow, I felt no distress, and have never since doubted, even for a second, that my conclusion was correct. I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true, for if so, the plain language of the text seems to show that the men who do not believe, and this include my father, my brother, and almost all of my friends. In other words, he was surrounded by atheists. Victorian society was ruled by atheists. Do you understand that? Will be everlastingly punished. And pardon my French, Mrs. Darwin's words, and this is a damnable doctrine. Mr. Darwin, how dare you? You have no definition of that second to last word, and you say that about Christianity? Can you see how philosophy is impinging upon science here? He continues, a man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God or future existence with retribution and reward, in other words, heaven or hell, can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or which seem to him the best ones. That's called hedonism. Welcome to the Western world in 2021. Just look around. If there is no God, if there's no punishment, if there's no retribution and reward, if there's no accountability, if we are just rearranged stardust, there is no ultimate foundation for ethics. Do what you want, whatever makes you happy. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. But there were people that realized the problems with this. Adam Sedgwick was a very famous, important early geologist. He named the Cambrian Era, that's the earliest section in evolutionary history where multicellular life forms, named after Cambria, the ancient name for whales. And he tutored Darwin 25 or more years before he wrote this letter. The month after The Origin of Species is printed, Sedgwick writes this: I have read your book with more pain than pleasure. Parts I read with absolute sorrow, because I think them utterly false and grievously mischievous. You've deserted the true method of induction. And now at this point, he's talking about the relationship between the physical and the spiritual. This is an old argument. How many of you are a child of the 80s like me? Remember the Police album? We are spirits in the material world, our spirits in the material. Remember that song, Ghost in the Machine? Well, is there a ghost in the machine, or are we just a machine? Old philosophical debate. Here he's saying, were it possible, which thank God it is not, to break the link between the physical and the spiritual, humanity in my mind would suffer damage and might brutalize it and sink the human race into a lower grade of degradation than any into which it has fallen, since its written records tell us of its history. He just predicted the history of the 20th century, where more people died at the hands of atheistic governments than we can even conceive. I'm talking about Nazi Germany, and above that, Communist Russia, and above that, Communist China. Millions upon millions of people were slaughtered by their governments because the people in government thought that killing people was no different than cutting the grass. Because a human being has no inherent worth. And how many millions of people have been slaughtered here in America since Roe v. Wade became law? Human beings have no inherent worth in an evolutionary system. Now, if you're an evolutionist and that makes you uncomfortable, deal with it. I'm just trying to apply rational deductions to a philosophical presupposition that you hold. My friends, there are lots of other topics to talk about. In my next two presentations, I'm going to be focusing more on genetics than anything. But pick a subject. It's probably on creation.com. I just wrote an article, and I think the article number was 14,000 something. So we've got thousands of articles 40 plus years of wisdom accumulated and written down on our website. If you have a question, go there. We're going to have a Q&A after my last talk this afternoon, but creation.com is a great resource for you. Out on the tables here, we have some amazing books and DVDs. We also have a pack. This is called the Intro Pack. There's a big pile of them right there on the table. It comes with the Creation Answers book. That's going to answer 99% of your questions because we wrote it to answer 99% of the questions. We listed all the questions we get in order of how popular they were. We took the top 60 questions, that's 99%, boom, in one book. The Intro Pack also comes with the #1 best-selling creation evolution book ever written, Refuting Evolution. I remember when I was teaching high school, right out of college, I spent 4 years teaching physics, chemistry, AP biology. I loved it. But in the middle of that, I was sent a document. Every teacher in the country was sent this document. It was a little book from the National Academy of Sciences about teaching evolution in a science classroom. This book, Refuting Evolution, uses 8th grade science to rebut that list of evidences for evolution the National Academy of Sciences put together. That's powerful. The pack also comes with a DVD. It depends on different DVDs in the pack. They just put one in there. Here's the high-tech cell, my favorite talk I've ever given in my life. I'm trying to describe how the cell works as a geneticist. I had to start comparing it to a computer. And very quickly we realized that the cell eclipses the most powerful computer technology ever made or even envisioned by man. And I predict that our computers are going to change over time. In fact, the computer architecture will change when we realize how the cell handles information. It's so complicated, it's unbelievable. That was a fun presentation. Here's a very interesting book, Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome. Taking the words of Darwinists, a straight up Darwinian theory, and saying these people don't actually believe it, and then applying some very simple ideas. I mean, the idea of the little red wagon is brilliant. The Princess and the Pea illustration, and multiple issues that he simplifies, which is very easy to understand illustrations to show you that evolution is dead in the water. If you're struggling with this yourself, I would recommend Christianity for Skeptics. If you're struggling with skeptics, I would recommend you read this to help answer why they're saying what they're saying. It's a very powerful book. But in each of my lectures this morning and this afternoon, I'm going to end with 1 Peter 3:15. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you a reason for hope that's in you, with meekness and fear. Modern translations say gentleness and respect. My friends, harsh and sarcastic facts shouted in anger don't generally point people toward the cross. But a gentle answer has often been used to open up somebody's eyes. Sure, sometimes acting aggressively and pointedly and just slamming someone down, that might help, but that's not usually the way it works. Friendship evangelism is powerful and profound. And that's what this is getting at. Now, I tried to model that this morning. It's not easy. Because when I get argued with, my Irish temper flares up and I just want to, but I can't. I'm told to answer gently. But this isn't just anyone. This is people asking a question. The militant atheist on YouTube deserves to be answered harshly. And yet we still have to be careful, because if we say something wrong, then we're then deserving a harsh answer ourselves. This is hard, but it's about cultural engagement. And hopefully what I've shown you this morning is a few things that will help you engage people. We're good? All right, let's say a quick prayer. We're going to have a break. We're going to come back for presentation number 2, and I do hope you'll return. Let's pray. Father, thank you for being the creator. Thank you for giving us a guide to creation. Thank you for telling us that you did it, and how long ago you did it, and how you did it. Thank you for not leaving us hanging with no answers to any of these things. Because if we didn't have Scripture, what would we believe? We'd kind of be forced to believe evolution, and evolution is going to contradict even your presence in our lives, your presence in the universe. Father, help us to be brave. Help us to learn. Forgive us for not having studied as much as we should and not being as far along in our understanding of Scripture and our understanding of science. We know we've spent a lot of time just wasting it. But we also know that you are a loving and patient God. And you have been patient with us. So be patient with us a little more, Lord. And just help us to learn, and help us as we learn to be willing to talk to other people about what we're learning. Amen.